Mr. President, there are one or 2 points I'd like to make, if I may.
Go ahead, General.
One, our hopes for recalling the 843rd bomb wing are quickly being reduced to a very low order of probability.
2, in less than 15 minutes from now, the Rustlers will be making radar contact with the planes. 3, when they do, they are going to go absolutely ape, and they're going to strike back with everything they got. 4, if, prior to this time, we have done nothing further to suppress their retaliatory capabilities, we will suffer virtual annihilation.
Andrew Krystal with you. The sky is falling. Little scene from Dr. Strangelove there. But moving from fiction and satire to reality, Matthew Kroenig has written The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. Recently, the Pentagon released its nuclear posture review. It described an increasingly challenging international security environment, as well as a need for the USA to strengthen its nuclear posture and to deter strategic attacks on itself and its allies. Here to discuss is Matthew Kroenig, the author of The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. Dr. Kroenig is a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council and an associate prof in the Department of Government and the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Dr. Kroenig is the author and editor of 6 books, including his most recent, as I mentioned, The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. Welcome, Matthew, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Well, I couldn't resist Dr. Strangelove there. Something that we said on the phone or in an email, I forget which, prior to you coming on just now. I believe that you and I, in our lifetimes, will see the use of nuclear weapons. I was disappointed and shocked that you agreed with me. Explain.
Well, I hope that's, hope very much that's not the case, but the number of countries around the world possessing nuclear weapons is increasing. Countries around the world are relying more, not less, on nuclear weapons in their strategy. We see that with Russia, Pakistan, and North Korea. And the only reason that nuclear weapons deter conflict is because there's some risk they could be used. So I think over time, the risk that these weapons gets used well, it's almost certain that they'll be used at some point. And, I'm a relatively young man. I'm 40 years old. So in the next 40 years or so, I think there's a risk that they could be used.
Let's talk about America's nuclear security posture. Many people feel that it's overkill. Can you explain why, quote-unquote, overkill is actually good deterrence policy?
Well, one thing people don't understand about U.S. nuclear strategy is the United States doesn't do so-called counter-value targeting. I think many people think, the United States targets its nuclear weapons at other cities, and so if we have enough nukes to blow up Moscow and blow up Beijing, that's enough to ruin their day, and that's enough. But the United States has never done this so-called, well, at least not since World War II, this kind of counter-value targeting. Rather, the United States plans to use its nuclear weapons to destroy enemy nuclear weapons. So target Russian submarine bases, Russian ballistic missile silos, Chinese ballistic missile silos, etc. And there are 2 reasons for that. One is moral. The United States doesn't purposely slaughter innocent civilians. We follow the law of armed conflict and target only legitimate military targets. But the second one is strategic. Every nuclear weapon we destroy over there is a nuclear weapon that's not landing on our territory or the territory of our allies in the event of a nuclear war. So how many nuclear weapons do you need for that counter-force strategy? Well, it depends on how many nuclear weapons your enemy has. So when we have Russia, China, North Korea with many nuclear weapons, then the United States needs many nuclear weapons as well.
I'm going to ask you a simple question, and I'll use the metaphor of Sputnik. Sputnik, of course, was the 1950s launch by Khrushchev. That shot was 50s or 60s, 59 or 60. When was Sputnik? It doesn't matter. The point is, it's okay, never mind. It's easily Googleable. Sputnik, though, was the first orbiting satellite. It shocked America, and it sparked and intensified the space race, which concluded with Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. But the Sputnik event shocked America in its bipolar battle with the USSR at that time, in that Soviet technological prowess, borrowed from the Germans post-war, had allowed it to leapfrog ahead by actually putting a satellite up there. So I want to ask you, Professor Kroenig, what is the new Sputnik? What will be the new dislocator or disruptor technologically? Would it be laser-based weapons that can knock out satellites that would guide intercontinental ballistic missiles with MIRVs, multiple independently retargetable reentry vehicles? Is it laser weapons? Is it satellite destroyers? What is it?
It's a good question. There are a lot of emerging technologies on the horizon that are going to very much change defense policy, but I also think human society broadly. 3D printing, artificial intelligence, lasers, or so-called directed energy is another name for them. The one I worry the most about, though, and that I think will change things the most, is artificial intelligence combined with robotics to essentially create killer robots. You know, if the way we've thought about war in the past is humans fighting humans, increasingly it's robots or machines fighting humans with drones and capabilities like that. And I think in the future it'll be robots fighting robots, and robots will be making the robots. And so I think that's something to keep an eye on. Armed drones, armed with both artificial intelligence and military capabilities, essentially, again, killer robots.
Let's talk about some of your notions in the logic of American nuclear strategy. What, first of all, can you provide to people in terms of dispelling some beliefs that are perhaps untrue with regards to nuclear weapons and deterrence?
Well, the first and most important one is the one I mentioned earlier. Most people assume, one nuclear weapon is enough to ruin anybody's day. Therefore, why does the United States have such a large arsenal? And again, if all we wanted to do was blow up Moscow, that would work. But we do this counter-force targeting, and so our number of nuclear weapons depends on the enemy number of nuclear weapons. Second point is U.S. nuclear weapons are special. The United States doesn't just try to deter attacks on itself. Rather, we extend nuclear deterrence essentially to the entire free world. We have nuclear security guarantees to 30 formal treaty allies in Europe and Asia. Other informal partners also rely on our nuclear umbrella. And so a strong U.S. nuclear deterrent, I think, is really essential to peace and stability in Asia and in Europe. And if it weren't for U.S. nuclear weapons, it's very likely that Germany, Japan, South Korea, Poland, other countries would build their own nuclear weapons. So many people, I think, see nuclear weapons as evil, and they are indeed the most destructive weapons on Earth. But I do think that U.S. nuclear weapons have provided a lot of peace and have actually contributed to nuclear nonproliferation.
Let's talk about security brinksmanship synthesis theory.
Yes, so this is the central argument of the book. And scholars going back decades have thought about nuclear deterrence essentially as a game of chicken. Imagine two cars on a collision course, which one will swerve first. And they think about it that way because neither side wants a crash. Neither side wants a nuclear war. On the other hand, countries still have conflicts of interest. They still want to get their way. They don't just want to swerve and give the other side its way. And I think you can see this in crises today with the United States and North Korea, United States and Russia, kind of playing these games of chicken. And essentially the argument of my book is in a game of chicken, we might expect the smaller car to swerve first, even if a crash is bad for both. So if you were going to play a game of chicken, would you prefer to drive a Hummer? Would you prefer to drive a Prius? I know I'd prefer the Hummer. And that's essentially the logic of U.S. nuclear strategy. Because we have all of these extended nuclear deterrent guarantees, we're essentially promising every day to be prepared to play a game of nuclear chicken on behalf of Estonia against Russia, on behalf of South Korea against North Korea, on behalf of Japan against China. So if you're playing potentially dozens of games of nuclear chicken every day, on behalf of the entire free world. Again, you don't choose to drive a Prius. If you get a choice, you'd rather drive a Hummer. And that's exactly what the United States does, and why it's chosen to have this robust nuclear posture for decades.
We came close to war before. Arab and the Israeli War of 1973, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Can we talk about those? And you reference those historical events in your book.
Yes, so those are some of these cases of nuclear chicken where the countries got pretty close to a crash before somebody finally swerved. Cuban Missile Crisis, probably the closest the world has ever come to nuclear exchange. 1973 Arab-Israeli War, people might not know this one, but the United States made some pretty explicit nuclear threats against the Soviet Union to try to deter them from intervening in the war. War was primarily between Israel and Egypt, United States supporting Israel, Soviet Union supporting Egypt. Soviet Union threatened to intervene. The United States threatened nuclear war to keep them out, and the threat worked. But in both of these cases, we see leaders paying attention to the nuclear balance of power, talking about who has the advantage, invoking that as a reason to escalate the crisis or not. So again, I think kind of concrete evidence of how this superiority brinkmanship synthesis theory works in practice. The country driving the Hummer was willing to make the threats. The country driving the Prius swerved in the end.
Daniel Ellsberg is a soon-to-be guest on my broadcast, Professor Kroenig. Daniel Ellsberg, of course, was the author of the Pentagon Papers. He didn't author it. He worked for the RAND Corporation, which is research and development, short for research and development. RAND study with the Pentagon produced the Pentagon Papers, as it was known. Daniel Ellsberg worked on the study. He was one of several people. When he released the study, it created the movie The Post, the recent film, and, of course, the big story in the Washington Post. And Nixon went crazy, which also resulted in him breaking into Daniel Ellsberg's office. He later became a psychiatrist. But he has written a new book, and in his book he says basically nothing has changed in terms of how nuclear warfare would unfold. You say?
Well, it's interesting you mention that, because before leaking the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg was a nuclear strategist at the RAND Corporation. And in fact, some of these models of nuclear chicken I'm referring to, Daniel Ellsberg was one of the people who's done the most to develop those ideas intellectually. And nothing's changed. I think there are some things that are consistent. I think there are some things that have also changed. One of the major things that's changed is during the Cold War, the United States essentially had only one nuclear-armed adversary. So it was relatively simple in hindsight. Today, the United States has at least three and arguably more nuclear-armed adversaries. So Russia, China, North Korea. So essentially, we need three different nuclear strategies to deal with these three different threats, which are very different. But that also creates complications. How can you threaten to have an overwhelming kind of capability against North Korea, which we threaten to have, while at the same time telling Russia and China that we're not seeking a first strike capability against them.
Last question. I just have a short question because I'm running out of time. Does North Korea need nuclear weapons to survive? And can America live with North Korea having nuclear-tipped ICBMs?
No and no. So I'm very hopeful that we can get an agreement to denuclearize North Korea at this upcoming summit. It'll be difficult, but I don't think impossible.
Will America attack North Korea if it's committed to having intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads?
It's hard to predict the future. I doubt America would act first. That's not really consistent with our culture or history, but I do believe that if North Korea looks like it's going to attack or goes through with an attack, it will be the last thing that Kim Jong-un ever does.
So America will live with, just like it's lived with Pakistan, just like it's lived with others with nuclear weapons, can America live with North Korea being nuclear?
No, I don't think so.
That means war.
Well, I think we can get there short of war, actually. If you can increase the economic pressure, political pressure so much that Kim Jong-un fears that it could lead to the collapse of his regime, then at least you force him into a difficult dilemma where he may be willing to seriously discuss giving up his nukes, and I hope that's what he has in mind for this upcoming summit.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us. The book that you have to get is The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. Matthew Kroenig is the author. Matthew, do not, if you're buying, make sure they're canned goods. Make sure you have a deep basement.
and water as well.
Lots of water. And we can barter coffee and ammunition. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
The end of the world is nigh. When I come back, let's talk about what's going on with your home. Because the bottom may fall out of the real estate market, like it or not, in this country. Coming back with more here on Krystal Nation.
Oh,